The gatekeeper unbars the city gate before the sun is fully up. It is the largest structure most people in this town will ever see, built by human hands. Stone arches 3 times the height of a man, wide enough for 2 chariots to pass each other without slowing down, wide enough for a column of soldiers to march through 4 abreast, shields still on their arms. By mid-morning, a fig seller's cart will roll through this gate next to a wedding procession, next to a tax collector, next to a shepherd driving goats to market. And none of them will have to wait. None of them will have to turn sideways. The gate was built for traffic. The gate was built to never make anyone stop. You could walk through it without even deciding to. That's the whole point of a gate like that. Now picture a different scene. A hillside above the Sea of Galilee, the grass still cool from the night, a crowd sitting close together because more people kept arriving than anyone expected. A rabbi from Nazareth has been talking for what feels like hours, and what he said so far has not been comfortable. He has told them that anger is its own kind of murder. That looking at someone the wrong way is its own kind of theft. That loving your enemies is not a suggestion. And now, as he starts to bring it all home, he reaches for an image every single person in that crowd has seen with their own eyes, because they walked through one to get here. Enter through the narrow gate. You have probably heard this verse read in a church service, printed on a bookmark, maybe stitched into a pillow somewhere in your grandmother's house. And if you're like most people, you heard it as a warning about being good enough. Try harder. Sin less. Squeeze yourself down until you fit. That is not what this sentence is doing. That is not even close to what the original language is doing. This is not a sermon about being good enough. This is not a riddle about church attendance. This is not a warning about being sent somewhere terrible for breaking a rule you didn't know existed. This is a description of an actual doorway, a kind of gate every person on that hillside had walked through, and a kind of gate almost none of them had ever even noticed. And here's the detail that's going to matter later, so hold on to it. There are 2 kinds of gates in this story. The first one is the kind we just walked through. Wide, grand, built for crowds. The kind every city in the Roman world was proud to show off. But there's a second gate, a narrower one. The kind nobody builds an arch over. The kind nobody photographs. We're going to find that second gate before this video is over. But first, you need to understand something Jesus already knew when he opened his mouth on that hillside, something written into the Hebrew imagination 1,000 years before he ever stood up to teach. The idea of 2 roads, 2 gates, 2 ways to live did not start with Jesus. It started somewhere much older, much wetter, and much more terrifying. It started with a man building a boat in his backyard for 100 years while his neighbors laughed at him. 100 years. That's roughly how long Noah spent building something nobody around him believed he needed. You have to sit with that for a second. Not 100 days. Not 100 sermons preached to people who walked away rolling their eyes. 100 years of hammering wood, sealing seams with pitch, raising the sides of a structure bigger than anything else in that valley, while the sky stayed blue and the rivers stayed where they were, and his neighbors kept building their houses, planting their fields, marrying their daughters, living exactly the way people had always lived. There was a wide way available to Noah. It was called everyone else's life. It was the obvious choice, the comfortable choice, the choice that didn't get you mocked at the well. And there was a narrow way, one door, on one boat, built by one family who believed something nobody else believed. When the water finally came, it didn't come slowly. It didn't give anyone a chance to renegotiate. There was exactly one door that mattered that day, and it was already shut. Stay with me, because the pattern doesn't stop there. It gets older, and it gets more personal. Several centuries later, a different family stands in a different doorway, not building it, but painting it. You can picture the scene. A low mud brick house in Egypt, the smell of roasting lamb drifting out into a street already thick with dread, because word has gone around that tonight is different. Tonight, something is coming through every house in the land. And Moses has told them exactly what to do about it. Take the blood of the lamb, paint it on the doorframe, the sides, and the top. Not the whole house, not the whole street. One specific doorway, marked in one specific way. Picture the mother in that house, brush in hand, painting blood above her own children's heads, not knowing for certain if it would work, only knowing that she'd been told it would. That night, the angel of death moved through Egypt, and the text says it plainly. Where the blood was on the doorframe, the angel passed over. Where it wasn't, it didn't. Same night, same city, same air. The only difference between a house of life and a house of grief was one narrow doorframe, marked the way you'd been told to mark it. Here's what most people miss when they read the Exodus story. Nobody got to argue their way through that night. Nobody got extra credit for being a particularly devout Egyptian or a particularly hard-working slave. The door wasn't wide enough for arguments. It was exactly as wide as the blood on the frame, and not 1 inch wider. 2 stories, 2 doors, a boat, and a doorframe. And both of them are pointing at the exact same thing Jesus is about to say on that hillside above Galilee, centuries before he says it. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the next group walking toward that gate isn't who you'd expect. When you picture the crowd on the wide road, the one Jesus says leads to destruction, who do you picture? Maybe the obviously cruel, the obviously corrupt. The people everyone already agrees are headed the wrong direction. But Jesus has spent this entire sermon, every single sentence leading up to this moment, talking to a specific audience. And it isn't the obviously bad people. It's the Pharisees, the most religious men in Jerusalem. Men who fasted twice a week, who tithed down to the herbs in their garden, who could quote the law from memory, and had never once been seen breaking the Sabbath in public. They are not walking toward the wide gate because they're wicked. They're walking toward it because it's wide, because it's the road everyone respectable is on, because it has never once occurred to them that the gate marked righteous might not be the same gate as the one marked narrow. And that's the hope hiding inside this hard sentence. Because if the door isn't reserved for the perfect, and it isn't reserved for the obviously broken either, then it's open to anyone who'll actually stop and look and choose the door nobody's lined up at. So, before we go any further, let's name the pattern out loud, because it's about to get even clearer. Every single time God draws a line in this story, the line looks the same. One door is wide, obvious, and crowded. The other is narrow, specific, and almost empty. Not because it's hidden, but because almost nobody bothers to look for it. If you're finding this useful so far, this is the part where I'd ask you to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because we're about to walk straight into the part of the Sermon on the Mount most people never get explained to them properly. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now, back to the gate. Let's go back to that word, narrow, because the English has been hiding something from you. The Greek word Jesus uses is stenos. It shows up in verse 13 and verse 14, the exact same word, both times. Some English translations switch it up, calling the gate narrow the first time and small the second, but that's a translation choice, not something in the original text. Jesus said one word, twice, stenos. It doesn't just mean narrow the way a hallway is narrow. It means pressed in, compressed. Squeeze down on every side until there's barely room for one body to pass through at a time. Now think back to that gate we opened at the beginning of this video, the wide one. 3 chariots across, built for armies, for parades, for crowds that never had to slow down. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing decades after Jesus' death, describes the walls and the gates of Jerusalem in exhausting, almost loving detail. The scale of them, the engineering, the sheer civic pride poured into every archway. Cities in the Roman world did not build modest gates. A gate was a statement. A gate told you, before you even crossed the threshold, how important this place wanted you to think it was. That's the gate on the wide road. Built to impress. Built to be seen. Built so that anyone, of any character, of any intention, could walk through without anyone checking. The Stenos gate is the opposite of every architectural instinct in the ancient world. Nobody builds a monument to it. Nobody widens it for traffic. It stays exactly as narrow as it's always been, whether one person walks through it or 1,000,000 people walk past it without noticing it's there. And this is where it gets remarkable, because the wide gate isn't full of obviously evil people congratulating themselves on their wickedness. Go back to the Pharisees standing in that crowd on the hillside. These are men who have spent their entire lives building fences around the law so they wouldn't accidentally break it. They have categorized which knots are permissible to tie on the Sabbath. They have measured the exact distance they're allowed to walk before it counts as travel. By every visible measurement available to first-century Judea, these are the most disciplined, most devout, most rule-following people in the room. And Jesus looks at them, at the people everyone else in that crowd would have pointed to as the gold standard of righteousness, and tells them they might be walking through the wrong gate. Not because they're lazy, not because they're secretly wicked, because they have confused the width of the road with the rightness of the road. They have assumed that because everyone respectable is walking beside them, they must be headed somewhere good. This is not about the worst people finding the narrow gate. This is not about the best people finding the wide gate. This is not a story about who deserves which doorway. This is a story about who actually stops long enough to look for the one nobody's lined up at. Here's the part nobody tells you about this passage. The wide gate isn't guarded by demons or marked with warning signs. It's guarded by nothing at all. That's what makes it dangerous. You don't have to choose evil to end up walking through it. You just have to never stop walking long enough to ask whether the crowd you're in is actually headed where you think it's headed. The Pharisees weren't villains. They were the most respectable people in Jerusalem. And that is exactly why this sentence was aimed at them, and not at the tax collectors, and not at the obvious sinners sitting quietly at the edges of that crowd, half convinced this teaching couldn't possibly be for people like them. It was for everyone. That's what made it so dangerous to say out loud. Now we get to find that second gate. Remember the one I mentioned at the very beginning of this video? The kind nobody builds an arch over. The kind nobody photographs. Watch what happens to the most respectable man in this entire story. His name is Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee among Pharisees. A man so devoted to the wide, respectable, rule-following road that he has letters of authority in his bag, permission from the religious leaders in Jerusalem to track down followers of a crucified rabbi and drag them back in chains. Saul is not walking toward Damascus by accident. He is walking with purpose, with confidence, with the full certainty of a man who has spent his entire life convinced he is already on the right road. You can picture the heat of that desert stretch between Jerusalem and Damascus, the dust on his sandals, the men walking beside him, just as certain as he is. This is the widest gate in the entire story. A man fully convinced of his own righteousness, walking with armed confidence down a road built, paved, and respected by everyone he answers to. And then the light hits him. Not a metaphor, not a feeling. A light brighter than the desert sun at noon, and a voice that knocks him flat on the ground before his legs even understand what's happening. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? 3 days. 3 days of darkness, of not eating, of not drinking, of sitting in a stranger's house in Damascus with sand still in the creases of his hands, waiting to find out what he's just walked into. He is not alone in that house. There is a man in that city named Ananias, not a famous man, not a man whose name you'd find carved over a synagogue door. A disciple who, when a vision told him to go find Saul of Tarsus and lay hands on him, would have had every good reason to say no. He knew the name, Saul. Everyone in the Damascus church knew the name Saul, and none of them knew it well. But Ananias went anyway. He found the house, he found the man in the dark, and he called him brother. That is what a narrow gate looks like from the inside. Not a theological victory. A single man walking down a single street to find a single person who had been sitting in the dark for 3 days and had finally run out of road. Here's what nobody fully appreciates about this story. Saul didn't choose the narrow gate. He didn't deserve it. He didn't earn his way toward it through better theology or harder fasting. He was the most wide-gate man you could possibly invent. Confident, respected, certain, armed with paperwork. And the narrow gate found him anyway, on a desert road, in the middle of doing exactly the wrong thing as hard as he possibly could. That's the second gate. It isn't the gate of the people who deserve it most. It's the gate that only ever lets one person through at a time, because that's what Stenos actually means. Not hard to deserve, pressed in, narrow enough that nobody else can walk through it standing next to you, holding your hand, hiding behind your reputation. You felt a version of this, even if you've never been knocked off a horse by a light from heaven. Think about the last time you stood in an airport, watching a security gate funnel an entire crowded terminal down to a single lane. Hundreds of people behind you, families, businessmen, a soldier coming home, somebody's grandmother with a rolling suitcase, and not one of them can walk through that gate for you. Not one of them can stand next to you and split the difference. The terminal is wide. The gate is exactly one person wide. And no matter how many people you love are standing in that crowd with you, when it's your turn, you walk through alone. That is what Jesus meant. Not a moral obstacle course designed to keep people out. A doorway that by its very nature can only ever be walked through one decision at a time. Your decision, not your parents' faith, not your church attendance, not the reputation you've spent years building on the wide road. Saul walked out of that house in Damascus, 3 days later, a different man, walking through a gate he never would have chosen, toward a life he never would have written for himself. He went on to write more of what we now call the New Testament than anyone else, planting churches in cities he once would have walked past without a second glance, ending his life not with a title or a courtroom victory, but with a quiet sentence written from a prison cell, that he had fought the fight and finished the race and kept the faith. The gate didn't get wider because Saul finally deserved it. It was always exactly as narrow as it had always been. He just finally walked through it. So what do you actually do with this? 3 things, and I want you to sit with all 3 before you scroll away. First, the truth about this passage. The narrow gate was never a vague metaphor floating in the air. It was a real picture, drawn from real architecture, aimed at real people standing on a real hillside who had walked through both kinds of gates with their own 2 feet. Jesus wasn't inventing a scary idea to keep people in line. He was pointing at something they already understood and asking them to apply it to the one question that actually mattered. Second, what that means for you. The crowd on the wide road was never made up of obvious villains. It was made up of busy people, respectable people, people who never had a reason to stop and ask whether the road everyone else was on was actually headed somewhere good. You don't end up on the wide road by choosing evil. You end up there by never choosing anything at all, by letting the crowd decide your direction for you. And third, the part that should actually stay with you tonight. The gate is narrow because of what it is, not because of what you've earned. It is exactly one person wide. Not your church, not your family's faith, not the reputation you've spent years building on the wide, respectable road everyone around you is already walking. Just you, standing in front of a doorway that has been waiting, unchanged, since long before you were born, narrow enough that no one can walk through it for you, and wide enough that it has never once turned away a single person who actually stopped to look for it. Saul didn't deserve to find it. He just stopped resisting it long enough to walk through. So here's the question I want you to actually answer in the comments below, not just scroll past. Which gate have you been walking through without realizing it? And what would it cost you to stop and look for the other one? Because somewhere between the gate you can see from the road and the gate that's pressed in tight enough to fit only you, there is a door. And it has been open this entire time.